Thank you all. Please be seated. Any arrival is better than no arrival. Thank you all for coming as the Bush Center launches what we call a Freedom Collection. I want to welcome the dissidents and freedom advocates who are here and those watching on webcast. I want to welcome Gerald Turner, who is the president of Southern Methodist University, our partner in advancing causes that we believe will be transformative. I welcome Mark Langdale and Jim Glassman and others who lead the Bush Institute. I particularly want to give a shout out to Amanda Sitzner as well as Lindsay Lloyd for their vision, or helping implement the vision of the Freedom Collection. Kristen Silverberg, who was ambassador to the EU during my administration, will be moderating a conversation with our dear friend, the president of Liberia. Joseph Reese, the former ambassador to East Timor, worked with Kristen to implement, or to help implement, what I'm about to describe. So the Bush Center believes that freedom is universal, that deep in the soul of every man and woman on the face of the earth is the desire to live in a free society. We believe that freedom yields peace, and therefore we believe it's in our nation's interest that we stand side by side with dissidents, political prisoners, courageous folks who demand their God-given right. The Bush Center's, one way we're doing that is through the Freedom Collection. As you will see, the Freedom Collection honors courage. It reminds us of our duty to be always on the side of human rights and human dignity and the right for people to live in a free society. And hopefully, the Freedom Collection will serve as an inspiration for those who are on the front lines of demanding their God-given rights. I have the high honor of introducing the first female elected head of state on the continent of Africa, a great lady. She's known, by the way, in Liberia as the Iron Lady for her strong leadership. She's also known as Ma for her kind heart. She received the Nobel Prize recently, and here's what she said: "The windows of closed chambers where men and women have been unspeakably abused are being opened, and the light is coming in. Democratization, if tentatively, are taking roots in lands unaccustomed to freedom." At the Bush Center, we strongly agree. Please welcome Ellen Johnson Sirleaf.
Madam President, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much for doing this. I just wanted to start with an issue that's very central to the work of the Bush Institute, which is the role of women in helping to promote democracy and human rights around the world. And I wonder if you could say a few words about the role that women played in Liberia.
One of our major women organizations, headed by Lima Bowie, gathered women from all walks of life who sat in the rain and in the sun, advocating for peace, challenging a military dictatorship. And subsequently, at peace talks in Accra, they mobilized themselves. They held all of the warlords hostage until they agreed to sign the peace agreement. And that really broke the logjam that had been holding back this agreement for peace. They were just wonderful women with courage, with determination, with tenor, that stood up against all odds and, in a way, made a major contribution to the peace that Liberia enjoys today.
You yourself spent time in prison for your role in this period. And I was interested, during your Freedom Collection interview, you mentioned that you came out of prison stronger than when you went in. And I wondered if you could say a word about what you meant by that.
Well, I was able in prison to see how the underprivileged are treated, to see how things that we take for granted, our freedom, our comfort, can be compromised by those who lack power, by those who lack influence, by those who lack access in our society. And it just strengthened my own conviction that when I got out, I would work harder to bring freedom, to bring equality and equity to all in our society.
Can you say a word about the role of the United States during this period? So both during the Doe government and the Taylor government, and also in the period leading up to your election as president. Were there things the United States did very well, things we didn't do as well?
Well, I think the United States has always had a good relationship with Liberia, and through different administrations and different governments, different regimes, they've been supportive. But at times when those regimes have not lived up to their expectations, they have withdrawn support, advocated change. So the Doe government enjoyed support. The Taylor government started on a bad note and did not really live up to anyone's expectations or to the promise to the Liberian people, did not get that support. But let me say that once we had democratic elections and I was able to succeed, the U.S. came very forcibly behind us, in a way wanting to say to Liberian people that the years of anguish had ended, and as long as we stayed on the right course, we'll get the support. As you may also know, President Bush was very instrumental in helping to bring our war to an end. He took a very strong, courageous position, and the U.S. just stepped up to the plate and provided us with very critical support, the rebuilding of our army, getting our institutions functioning again, beginning to repair our broken infrastructure. And you may say that because the U.S. became a strong and first partner, that sent a signal to the world that Liberia was going to be given an opportunity to fix itself, to move from being a pariah or broken state to being one that could easily become a post-conflict success story. And so we just want to thank President Bush and all of those. There was a bipartisan support, and today that support has continued, and the United States remains our #1 partner.
A member of our social media audience named David sent the following questions along those lines. He asked, what are some of the best ways everyday Americans can help support the progress of democracy and human rights in Africa?
Working with those institutions that partner with governments in promoting democracy, ensuring that good examples all over the world get the kind of attention, get told, networking with those local institutions that share the same values and work for the same objectives. And there's a lot of that going on in the world today, not only between North and South, but also across South, where countries in Africa and in other regions are reaching out to each other and being able to, of course, today, with the technological revolution, the demonstration effect, as people watch television, scenes and see how groups are standing up for their freedoms and being courageous in challenging repression. I think that strengthens all, and it makes the reach across borders and across oceans much easier.
Another member of our social media audience, Rachel S., asked, what are the greatest obstacles Liberia faced during your struggle for democracy?
The employment of youth. We have thousands and thousands of young people, many of them who served as child soldiers, many of those conscripted into war and into warring factions at very early age. Bypassed by education, they have no skills. They are young adults. Some of them are even old, going well into being full adults. They have no skills, they have education. And they need jobs to bring back their dignity, to be able to support themselves and their families. Our challenge is what do we do about them? How do we get them into a marketable situation? How do we educate them at their age? Today we decided that the best thing we can do through technical and vocational training is to give them a skill so that they can be employed in the many operations that will be starting in the country as a result of our success in mobilizing foreign direct investment. But they remain the vulnerable ones and the ones that can easily be lured back into doing the things that led us to conflict.
On that note, many Americans are watching this difficult period in Egypt, and they're worried about the direction of that country. And I wonder if you could say something about the lessons you learned as part of Liberia's transition. What are the things that countries can do to make sure they make the transition to democracy successfully?
I think one has to involve the people with knowledge about the difficulties, about how you respond to raised expectations, the reality of being able to make promises, being able to lead a transformation is a difficult one. There's no quick fix. There's no magic wand. And so one must be able to communicate this to the people, ask for patience, but also allow them to participate as much as possible in all spheres of society's activities. But even in those cases where, like in Liberia, where we had all the support and everyone was tired of war, our transition is still very difficult. Our transformation is still underway, and our full objectives have yet to be achieved.
What is the role of justice and accountability in that? Because, of course, the fact that Charles Taylor was tried for some of his crimes was an important step. But are there pros and cons to seeking justice against the former repressors of a country?
Well, there are times when, given the circumstances and in the interest of peace, when one must make some compromises, when one may have to reach beyond without sacrificing justice, but aim at reconciliation just to ensure that peace prevails. It's a balancing act, very difficult balancing act, and each society must be able to find that path based upon their own circumstances and their own conditions. The primary objective must be to maintain peace, to keep from going back into conflict, and to ensure that we have the opportunity to deliver to the people those services that they rightfully require.
Finally, at the end of every Freedom Collection interview, we ask the interviewee whether there's a message he or she would like to share with other dissidents working around the world. Is there a message you'd like to communicate to people working for democracy in their own countries?
To stay the course, remain courageous, take those positions, find your voices, and join others in being able to work for those objectives with determination, never giving up. In the end, success is sure. But don't go away. I've got to say something before you close it.
Yes.
I have to say good evening.
Please.
I'm going to start off where I should start it off by saying good evening to all of you gathered at the Bush Center for this Freedom Collection event. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there with you. Thank you, President Bush, for your kind and gracious introduction. It's always good to see you and to listen to you, even if it's by a video conference. You've been a true friend to our country and our people, and we have fond memories of you in Liberia. Laura, I'm also pleased that you are there this evening. I look forward to the opportunity to meet you both again in the near future.
Thank you, Madam President. It's my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Laura Bush.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and that was great to get to hear from Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. I got to represent the people of the United States at her inauguration, and it was very moving and really wonderful to see this very strong woman who'd been imprisoned now be inaugurated as the president of her country, and a country, of course, that the United States is particularly close to. Thank you very much to President Johnson Sirleaf, and thank you, Kristen. Thank you very much for introducing me and for moderating the conversation with President Johnson Sirleaf. I also want to recognize the Slovak ambassador to the United States who's joined us today, Peter Boria. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much for joining us. The Freedom Collection really was an idea of Kristen Silverberg's, who had worked for us, and some other people who had worked for in George's administration. And I want to thank you very much, Kristen, and I want to thank Ambassador Rees and Will Inboten, who have done very much to compile the Freedom Collection that we're going to get to see a little bit of tonight. And I want to thank everybody here who's joined us this evening. I'd like to acknowledge several people from President Bush's administration for their contribution to building the Freedom Collection. Paula Dobriansky, the former Undersecretary of State, worked on compiling this collection. Elliot Abrams, the Deputy National Security Advisor, did as well. And Michael Gerson, who was a former speech writer for President Bush, worked on this collection. And of course, tonight, I want to especially recognize the freedom advocates and dissidents in the audience whose voices are a part of the Freedom Collection. So thank you all for telling your stories and for your courage. George and I have met with dozens of dissidents and democracy and human rights activists from around the world. At the White House, we hosted the Dalai Lama and the late Czech President Václav Havel. We met with men and women from Iran, from North Korea, from Burma, from Cuba, and from many other tyrannies who've risked everything so that their children might know freedom. Their stories are inspiring, and beginning today, the Freedom Collection makes their stories available to everyone. The Freedom Collection is an active, living archive that documents the personal stories of men and women who've been involved in the important freedom movements throughout the 20th century and now in the 21st century, including His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet and the late Czech President Václav Havel, and many others. Already, our team has interviewed nearly 60 freedom advocates whose accounts represent the freedom movements from across the globe. In the coming months, the Freedom Collection will expand to help preserve more stories of the world's democracy and human rights movements. The death of President Havel in December reminds us of the urgency of this task. The democratic transformations that took place in Central and Eastern Europe, South Africa, and much of Latin America began just a few decades ago. And it's important to record the stories of the men and women who led these movements. Many of the stories in the Freedom Collection are historical accounts of freedom's triumph over tyranny. Others are told by activists who are still longing for their freedom. The Freedom Collection includes stories from people in countries where the transition to freedom and democracy is underway. We've interviewed men and women in Tunisia and Egypt who are working to build the democratic institutions that are necessary for freedom to flourish. And in the collection are accounts from men and women in Burma, where years of oppression failed to stifle voices opposing the military junta. Today, more than half of the world's population live in countries where basic human rights are restricted or denied. Dissidents and political prisoners in these countries remind us that even prison and oppression cannot silence the call for liberty. In many parts of the world, women are the ones who are left out, just like we were in the United States until 1920. And they're lifting their voices and they're asking to be heard. Tonight, Rola Dashti, a former parliamentarian from Kuwait, has joined us. And I want Rola to know that I've been quoting her in speeches. In 2005, she said, "Half a democracy is not democracy." Later that year, women gained the right to vote and run for office in Kuwait. The Freedom Collection reminds us of our own history and the struggle for liberty and the challenge and the struggle for liberty that we also still every day must work on. And the Freedom Collection reminds us of the challenges that we have to support freedom movements around the world. To those still struggling against tyranny and working to build democracies, the Freedom Collection provides encouragement and inspiration. We want all those who are speaking out against oppression and injustice to know that we are standing with them. So tonight I'm happy to introduce a short documentary that's part of the Freedom Collection. And this documentary tells the stories of why men and women become dissidents and choose to speak out. So thank you all for joining us this evening.
In our time, freedom has great historical momentum, but it is not an impersonal force. It always advances through the choices and courage of individuals. A freedom revolution often begins in a few minds, a few hearts, among men and women who risk everything for the sake of a universal ideal. They reject the counsel of fear, apathy, and despair. They accept sacrifices for a future they may not live to see, and they are capable of unsuspected greatness. During meetings in the Oval Office, I was eager to hear their stories. And now the Bush Institute is collecting these stories in interviews conducted around the world. We have asked men and women who have inspired others to describe what inspired them, what ignited the fuse of their outrage and resistance. Why did they accept the difficult calling of a dissident's life? Ken Omar of Burma explains her decades of activism.
It was already in my blood as a person. For me, is whenever I see something injustice happen in front of me, whether it happened to me or someone else, I cannot take it. So when I was studying chemistry in my final year at the university, I came to be in a group of students who were simply demanding for the true release of a student a fellow student who was shot and killed by the police without any reason, really. This is a complete injustice, and I cannot take it. So that was the first time I decided that I will do something about it.
Dissidents are often motivated by a passion for truth and a refusal to participate in the lies that prop up tyrannical governments. Ammar Abdul Hamid was a writer and activist in Syria.
Many people said this is selfish on your part because the consequences can be borne by your family. But I also said to them in reply, the consequences of their silence have been borne by me and are being borne by all of you also. So silence has consequences. Not rocking the boat has consequences. And the consequences of not rocking the boat, it may not be the dramatic death that we see when people take to the street. It may not be arrests, but it's a death of hope.
Ariel Sigler Amaya was a boxing coach in Cuba.
Ellos comenzaban a decirme cosas de que yo tenía que hacérsela informar a los estudiantes míos, ¿sí? A aquellos alumnos que yo le impartía clases. Tenía que levantar la mano cuando yo no quería levantar la mano. Querían que yo riera cuando yo no tenía deseo de reír, cosas que para mí eran muy molestas. Y tenía que mentir cuando yo no quería mentirle a los estudiantes. Cosas estas que chocaba con ellos porque si yo fui educado en un régimen comunista tenía que necesariamente o obligatoriamente tenía que expresarle cuáles eran las ideas comunistas a esos estudiantes. Y confronté muchos problemas, confronté muchas dificultades por esta posición mía que opté en tratar de una vez y por todas abrirme ya paso hacia un pedido de libertad, hacia un reclamo de derechos que tiene el cubano como tal.
Democratic activists often speak of self-respect, a feeling that they could no longer participate in a failing, degrading system that was undermining their dignity and the dignity of their country. Václav Havel, the great Czech freedom fighter, made this point clearly.
Já myslím, že velmi důležité bylo, a to vždycky znova opakuji, když mluvím s těmi disidenty z těch zemí, kde ještě nějaký typ diktatury existuje, že velmi důležité byl ten dobrý pocit, že děláme něco, co je správné, co se má dělat. Nemáme ten nepříjemný pocit jakési upatlanosti, usmolenosti z toho, že děláme kompromisy nebo že neříkáme to, co si opravdu myslíme, že se ohýbáme, podřizujeme tomu tlaku.
The path of most dissidents leads through some desolate places where hope comes hard. Many find comfort in a power greater than any government. Pastor Bob Fu of China recalls his dark night of the soul as a student activist.
When the real bullies start shooting, when the tanks were ordered to crush many of the innocent citizens, including students, all over, students' leaders' dreams were broken. It was during that time I came to Christian faith. I accepted Christ as my Savior and Lord because I just lost hope on myself and on the political system, on the party, in general, even on the human being. And I was deeply despaired and disappointed, and thinking, how can I really make my dream come true? How can I change the society by changing the government?
In the past several decades, we have seen again and again that courage and vision can be more powerful than all the guns and lies of an oppressive government. We have seen how the sudden illumination of a single conscience can be the turning point in the history of a nation. It is our privilege and duty to recognize and help courageous advocates of freedom around the world. Our message to them is clear. When you stand for liberty, we will stand with you.
this first phase of the Freedom Collection, we have interviewed nearly 60 leading freedom advocates from around the world. In addition to President Sirleaf, we've interviewed 4 Nobel laureates and many well-known statesmen and women. But we have also interviewed the next generation of activists, including cyber dissidents from Cuba and Venezuela, and leaders of youth movements in Egypt and Tunisia. Portions of each of these interviews will be featured on our website, freedomcollection.org, which we hope will remind dissidents that they're part of a large network of a pro-freedom family. We also hope it will serve to inform and inspire Americans to continue our support for these movements. The site includes sections on each featured country to better inform visitors to the site of conditions in those countries. And we've also produced videos on specific themes. Along with the video we just aired, we have featured videos on the plight of prisoners of conscience, the role of women, and messages from dissidents to each other. Several of our remarkable Freedom Collection participants are with us here today. I'd like to introduce Duan Viet Watt. Professor Watt, will you stand? Thank you. Professor Watt is a writer and scholar from Vietnam. In 1976, he was imprisoned by the communist government and spent the next 12 years in a cell shared with 40 other prisoners. Upon his release, he began publishing an underground magazine and was arrested and detained without trial, then sentenced to 20 years in prison. He continued throughout his imprisonment to issue statements on democracy and was sent to a labor camp where he spent 4.5 years in solitary confinement. Amar Abdul Hamid. Amar is a Syrian human rights activist who founded the Tharwa Foundation, which is a grassroots organization that enlists citizen journalists to document conditions in Syria. In 2005, he and his family were forced into exile, but he remains one of the leading bloggers and activists on events in Syria. Marcel Granier. Is the Chief Executive Officer of Radio Caracas Television, which has supported democratic governance in Venezuela. Although the Chavez government has forced RCTV off the air, Marcel continues to live in Venezuela and to speak out for democracy and human rights. Ambassador Constancio Pinto. Ambassador Pinto is the ambassador of East Timor to the United States and a former leader of the underground movement for Timorese self-determination. In 1991, he was arrested, detained, and tortured. He escaped from Timor and served as his movement's representative in the United States until Timor achieved independence in 2002. Cristal Montañez Baylor. Cristal is a democracy activist from Venezuela who lives and works in Houston. From 2003 to 2008, she served as president of the International Venezuelan Council for Democracy, an organization dedicated to advancing democratic values and institutions. Pastor Bob Fu. Pastor Fu was a leader in the student democracy movement at Tiananmen Square. In his Freedom Collection interview, he talked about his conversion to Christianity, as you heard, and his arrest for running a secret Bible school. After his release, he and his wife Heidi escaped and were admitted to the United States as refugees. He continues to advocate for religious freedom on behalf of the China Aid Society located in Midland. And finally, Mohsen Sazagara. Mohsen is a former official in the Iranian government and a top aide to the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was imprisoned for speaking out against regime abuses. He is now a leader of Iran's Green Movement and a fellow at the Bush Institute. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the founding executive director of the Institute, Jim Glassman.
Thank you, Kristen. This is so emotional and inspirational. Kristen has worked on this for 3 years, and it's quite an accomplishment. I just want to thank Will Imboden, who ought to stand. I don't know where Will is. And if Will stands, he's 3 times as tall as everybody else. This was this was a little germ in your mind 3 years ago, and it's now coming to fruition. So thank you, Will. Will is a professor at UT Austin. He's a former State Department official. Dr. Oscar Elias Biset is the personification of the qualities that drive all of those who are part of the Freedom Collection: courage, commitment, humanity. He's a physician who has spent his life advocating vigorously and nonviolently for freedom and human rights in his native Cuba. For simply practicing freedom of expression, a right, as our Declaration of Independence reminds us, and as President Bush just said, that's given to us by God. Dr. Biset has been locked in the Castro brothers' prisons for 12 of his 51 years. In 2003, he was arrested along with 74 other dissidents in Cuba's Black Spring. His tales of his time in prison are just horrifying. 3 separate times, assassination attempts were made on his life. In 2007, while he was still in prison, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, by President Bush. Dr. Biset was released from prison about a year ago. The regime offered him exile, but he chose to stay in Havana. And if Fidel and Raul Castro thought that they could silence him by his years in prison, they were wrong. A week ago, the Wall Street Journal published his stirring op-ed piece, which said, among other things, that Cuba is run by a brutal regime that oppresses people, systematically violating their basic freedoms. He called on Pope Benedict during his current trip to Cuba to help. That day, Oscar received a visit from the regime's police. And what did Oscar and his wife, Elsa Morajon, do? Well, they photographed the policeman who had come to visit them and then tweeted that visit to the world. This is how the world has changed. Oscar was ordered to the police station for Friday morning, 2 days later. His response: if I lived in a democracy, I would have to attend. But since I live in a dictatorship and have not committed any crimes, I will not present myself. A few days ago in Havana, Dr. Biset recorded this special message.
Buenos días, presidente de los Estados Unidos, George Bush. Le envío un saludo cordial y le doy gracias por toda su obra presidencial y en su vida a favor de la libertad de la humanidad y por ser un amigo del pueblo cubano. Con el mismo cariño que lo han tratado en muchos países, así lo trataremos en una Cuba libre. Lo recibiremos con mucho amor y el pueblo cubano le entregará todo su cariño. Muchas gracias, amigo, y que el Dios bíblico lo bendiga a usted, su familia y a su nación. Hasta luego.
So if President and Mrs. Bush and Dr. Angel Garrido would please come up to the podium. And let me just briefly introduce Dr. Garrido as they come up. Dr. Garrido is a physician, a psychiatrist, who is vice president of the Lawton Foundation for Human Rights, which Dr. Biset heads. Dr. Garrido left Cuba for the United States at the age of 9. Dr. Garrido.
Thank you, Ambassador Glassman. Ladies and gentlemen of the free world, President Bush and Mrs. Bush. On November 5th, 2007, Mr. President, you had the vision to award the Presidential Medal of Freedom in absentia to a Cuban prisoner of conscience, Dr. Oscar Elias Biset, who was serving a 25-year sentence for defending human rights and advocating for freedom and democracy in Cuba. At that time, little did the world know that the Presidential Medal of Freedom provided the spiritual and physical strength for Oscar Biset while he endured a horrific and brutal imprisonment in Cuban's prisons. From his prison cell in 2007, Dr. Biset accepted the Presidential Medal of Freedom on behalf of the oppressed people of Cuba and vowed that the medal would never enter his island until Cuba is free. This month marks the first anniversary of Dr. Biset's liberation. Today, on behalf of Dr. Biset, I have the honor and privilege to present the Presidential Medal of Freedom to the Human Freedom Collection of the George W. Bush Institute. Honorable Señor Presidente Bush, usted es amigo de la libertad. Usted es nuestro amigo. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
We love you. We really do. To the right click. Now we have to open it. There we go.
Yes, beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And the citation.
Now we just have to-
So I hope you got a flavor of what we're doing. I had the honor of speaking to Oscar Biset yesterday. I told him that at least those of us associated with the Bush Center, and I hope students leaving SMU will dedicate their lives to making sure that people like Oscar Biset can live in a free society. And we got to understand how courageous this guy is and others around the world, and that's what the Freedom Collection does. It says courage is not in short supply, and that we in the United States, as comfortable as we are, must never forget that. The danger is we become an isolationist nation where citizens say it doesn't matter what happens overseas. We at the Bush Center believe it does matter what happens overseas for the sake of our own national security, but more importantly, for the sake of peace. We thank you for your interest. We thank you for your support. We look forward to expanding the Freedom Collection to make it the greatest collection of freedom ever. God bless.
Thank you, everyone. I also just want to thank Kristen King and April Zorski for putting this together. And